here for the capital markets session. We've got a huge area to cover and a very important topic. So I didn't want to do the usual kind of introductions because it's just going to take too long, and we wanted to get straight into more substantive discussions. So if we could just throw up a slide that we had prepared. Anyway. Well, while that's being prepared, I will just introduce very quickly by name and job title without going into too much detail. So next to me is Wael Aburida, Managing Partner of Halo Investment Management. Next is, you're not on the list, Niraj Agrawal from Crescent. Next is Fadi Al Said, Portfolio Management at Lazard Asset Management. Then we have Sharbel Azi, Senior Director at S&P Dow Jones Indices. And finally, Pankaj Gupta, co-founder and chief executive of Gulf Islamic Investments. Right, so on the screen there, you'll see I just thought to kick it off, let's just get a kind of reality check on how big the markets are in the GCC. And really this is the point I'm trying to make here is that from an investor's point of view, this market, at least the public markets in the GCC, are still relatively small. For example, Saudi Arabia, our biggest market, is the same market cap as Microsoft. Oman is the size of Campbell's Soup. UAE is the size of GE. Bahrain is the same size as Electronic Arts, which is a small video game company. So as you can see, and then on the right-hand side of the chart there, you can see in terms of daily traded volume. The whole of the GCC trades half the volume of Apple. It's just to put things in perspective from a global investor's point of view, how hard this market has to work to get noticed. But on that note, I thought I would just throw it open to the floor here and get your initial kind of reactions to that chart, whether you think it's relevant for this conversation or not. I think, Fadi, you had a view on this this chart coming from the kind of public markets perspective.
I think we're still young markets, and we have a long way to be like a mature market, but we're heading there. I think it's a good way also, just to be fair, you need to compare also the market cap to GDP. For usually developing markets, you see that the market cap to GDP is a higher ratio, because in younger markets and economies, usually the capital markets does not represent the full sectors. So a lot of the actual activity and the economic activity usually is not captured and represented yet in the capital markets. As we see, of course, more reforms and more attraction and more, of course, the foundation of capital markets, you will see more and more companies listing. And this, I'm not saying that we're going to just bridge the gap between these huge, humongous figures, but at least the incremental improvements will be significantly higher going forward.
Sharbel, do you think that there's a problem that this speaks to, this chart? I mean, why do you think that, well, as Fadi just said, I mean, a lot of the market, a lot of the money, a lot of the activity is not captured in the capital market, in the public markets. But is that a problem, or do you think that's okay? We could.
Look, I think given the region that we are in, it's a very attractive region. I think there's a lot of regulatory and legislative issues that needs to be addressed. But as we move along, I believe that, I mean, if we look at Saudi, for example, in the past year or two, they've been trying to improvise and basically move forward from a capital market perspective. We've seen the shift in attracting foreign money into their markets, because they do believe at some point in the region, the regional money is not enough to grow the capital markets. We do need that foreign money. We do need that foreign sticky money to stay in the region and not rather be a speculative money that comes in and out of the region. That's very important for us to tackle. As an index provider, as S&P in general, we do promote three main pillars into the exchanges and the capital market authority. One is obviously transparency, one is governance, and I think governance and transparency go hand in hand. And I think the third important pillar is liquidity.
Yeah.
How do you attract liquidity? How do you make your markets more liquid? It comes through a different way. It's building the right financial ecosystems of these exchanges, regulatory bodies, capital market authorities. And I believe there has been a lot of work done in the region, and we do believe that there's still a lot of work to be done as well.
I mean, Wael, coming from Lazard's point of view, I mean, you're looking at this region from the point of view of a foreign investor. What do you think, how do we get out of the current situation towards a better place? What do you think are the key challenges that we're facing from the public markets point of view? And how do you play the public markets game versus the private equity and the non-public investments that you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the critical elements is that capital is quite efficient. So there's an ability to really forum shop. There are companies that are growing here in the region that are not even looking at the exchanges here as an option. They go straight to the LSE, they go to the Hong Kong Exchange, or they go to one of the exchanges in the US. And what you have to do is you have to make it very simple in terms of the process. You have to also create sufficient volumes, as was mentioned previously, where there's enough liquidity in the local markets. I think it's going to be difficult. I think it's going to be difficult for some time, because I think that there's too many markets, too many small illiquid markets here in the region, chasing very few opportunities. So I think it's going to have to take a point where there's a consolidator, and in effect you have kind of a pan-regional market at some point would probably be the most effective approach to be able to not only attract regional players who want to go public, but also start to attract companies outside the region who want to list here and have access to local fund flows.
But I mean, we've been talking about consolidating exchanges in the UAE and even the region for decades now, and it's happened all the way around the world, right? I mean, in Europe, in the States, you see mergers going on all the time. Why do you think we don't seem to be getting anywhere?
I think part of the reason is really a mentality of wanting to really close in and take ownership for certain markets. I think that there's going to, and at some point we're going to get to kind of a GCC-wide monetary system. But I think if we can link the two, that will start to take us towards that approach of having a larger market base.
Yeah, and I'll just jump straight across to the end there, because I think, Pankaj, you had a point to make about, because your point was actually, well, why does it matter whether a good idea that happens here lists in London or anywhere else? So, I mean, does it matter if this region has liquid, attractive markets, or should ideas just go wherever they can see the most benefit?
So, Tom, I have a different take on the topic. I believe, as we all know, the world is a global market. We all are moving towards a smaller and a smaller space. As you know, I would like to recall the picture which you showed, various companies comparing to the capital markets of each GCC country. But if you take a different twist, See, capital market is not about just about the exchange. It is about various players in it. The people who invest or the institution which invest, they are also stakeholder of the capital market. This region is blessed with those kind of institutions which can change the scenario of many capital markets in the world. So if you look at institution holding or the investment power of the institution, they are much bigger player than what this picture depicts. I'll give you an example, not trying to understate the requirement or the requirement of development of a capital market. Look at when we were in a recession and Citibank was having a trouble, where they came to. So this place rescued a global player like Citibank. So the strength of the market players of a capital market is not necessarily has to be at one place. So the point what I'm saying is not necessary that UAE or for that matter any other country should have the exchange, players, investor, everything. We should look at the world as a global player. You have copper at one place, but smelter at another place. So from that perspective, I feel that it's not necessary that we should have only focus on developing exchanges or capital market institution in GCC. We should try to capitalize on our strength. Our strength has always been export of capital. We should try to use that and develop a capital market in that particular perspective. So I come from that.
Yeah. Well, that actually leads us quite well on to the next sort of topic, which is really innovation and how the capital markets can act as a driver for innovation. I realize I haven't addressed a question to you yet, Niraj, but maybe that's where you could come in and just tell me, from your perspective, do you think the UAE currently has this kind of skill sets and the ecosystem that it needs to encourage and fund an innovation economy?
So, let me first contribute partially to the question you asked the last time. And I think this chart is symbolizing the disparity, but not showing the potential and the growth that lies in the region. The GCC and the MENA region is not only home to oil and gas, it's also home to capital. The reality is that capital has not manifested itself in the stock markets. Now, if you try and understand why that has not happened, you understand that partly it is a legislation which required family businesses to divest control by 55% ownership. I'm taking UAE as an example. The UAE commercial company law has just had an amendment where it's come down to 30%, and it's encouraging businesses to go public. I'll give you another piece of data. Roughly $750 billion is changing hands from second generation to third generation, and third generation to fourth generation, and family-owned businesses in the region. And that is a very, very good time to consider stock markets as a way of dealing with governance, liquidity, different aspirations of stakeholders. The third data point I'd like you to consider is the Saudi Aramco IPO. Saudi Aramco IPO, it's not happened, but it will happen sooner or later. It's a $2 trillion, and that still doesn't consider many other large state-owned enterprises in the region. But it will be the first step to try and correct this chart in promoting a culture of governance, transparency, information, and really getting more profitable businesses, along with legislative reforms on the stock market. The final piece I'd like to say is the late King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia forced many of the downstream companies, which had very favorable concessions for gas prices, to go public. So these were private companies which had favorable terms for gas prices, and they were all forced to go public. It's that sort of trend which needs to happen more and more within the region, along with legislative reform, to correct the data charts here. Going back to your question on innovation, What does innovation mean? Innovation means industry, technology. Now, if you look at the tech sector, the need for capital comes from angel investing, incubation, the first round, the second round, the third round. Sharjah has taken a lead in terms of providing innovation through initiative through His Highness, the ruler of Sharjah, through American University of Sharjah, through an enterprise called Shera, which encourages youth, not only in terms of giving capital, but more importantly in terms of skills and mentoring. We're very much a partner with Sharjah in that initiative. Dubai is doing the same. So I think in terms of building the ecosystem to support innovation, the first stage is this. The second stage is enactment of the bankruptcy law. The bankruptcy law has just been passed, but it still needs to take practical roots, not only in the UAE, but across the region. A lot of innovation comes from accepting that businesses will fail. You know, failure is not a shame. Failure is a way to become innovative. So I would say these are the two critical steps in building a foundation. A lot of family offices in the region are funding overseas rounds of funding, which I would say is series A, B, C, D, E, F. That trend has recently started with things like Kareem, which is the car hire company, etc., some of the other initiatives. So I would still say the ecosystem is at a very, very early stage right now to build it to a level where it can compete with the West.
Wael, what's your take on the innovation ecosystem?
I think there's been a lot of activity, actually a lot of positive activity, especially here in the UAE, but you're also seeing it in Saudi and some of the other GCC countries, both by the sovereign investors as well as by private capital to help incubate and foster through accelerators and other means startup companies, which is fantastic. The problem that we get into is that once these companies get to a point where they really need to start learning about governance, where it's not just a garage project, where they need to start building a business that's going to execute and try to attract contracts from multinationals or from companies like Itasalat, that's where they trip up. And the reason for that is that there really hasn't developed an ecosystem, a meaningful ecosystem of professional investment companies that can support these companies to get through to the next stage. So when you look at something, as was mentioned, Kareem, there's very few companies that have gotten to that unicorn stage. There's actually only just two. So there's a need for kind of a broader venture stroke private equity ecosystem that can help these companies get to a later stage. The other element is really the role of the family conglomerates here in the region. One of the things that I still struggle with, having been here almost a decade now, is some of the family groups that we work with, they've developed just massive tentacles of companies in various sectors. So they essentially incubate companies within their own organization, but they don't have a philosophy of culling the group. So you'll have businesses that are essentially stranded within their organizations that are really not going to get anywhere. So they should either spin them out or cut them off. And maybe this is because I was initially trained at a company at Intel where, if you can't be third, one of the top 3 in the world in a sector within the 5 years, it's killed. And that type of brutal efficiency is something that's still lacking here in the region. And I think that element does two things. It either kind of focuses resources on winners within the platform, and it also allows others to potentially take that business out and grow it, which is, again, a secondary source of opportunities for private equity outside of the region that you don't see here.
Fadi, you were going to jump in there.
Before talking about innovation, let's just take a step back and talk about the basics. Because I think we need to get the basics right before innovating, because I don't think we're in a position to innovate yet. Let's just go back to the basic definition of capital markets. Capital markets' main role and I would say target is to connect capital, to channel capital from liquidity pools or capital pools to companies that are productive, that are generating returns above the cost of capital. And in this formula, you have a lot of stakeholders. And each stakeholder is trying to pull the market or the role of capital market towards its own benefit. Unfortunately, what we've been seeing recently is that some stakeholders have been prevailing. The regulator role is to make sure that this formula works in a way that adds value to the economy and adds real, tangible impact on the GDP. What's happening is that you're seeing we're being obsessed with liquidity. We're talking about a result of something. We're just being obsessed with the result of efficient capital markets. So that's why what's happening on that perspective, this is the financial institutions as stakeholders are actually pushing the main mandate of the capital markets is to increase liquidity because it relates positively to profits. On the other side, you have big groups and investors are actually tilting the capital market into their intention where they're pushing or at least alienating the regulator in a way to their own benefit. So from my perspective, this whole relationship between all the stakeholders needs to be based on trust. If you don't have trust, if you don't have a balance between all kind of win-win situation between all the stakeholders, you will not have efficient capital markets. Because if the capital markets role just to increase liquidity, you will see what we saw. Non-productive pools of capital being listed just for the sake of listing market cap and liquidity. What is the added value of these companies? So the mission should be making sure that you give companies opportunities to raise capital that will be allocated in a productive manner that will have added value to the economies. It's not only liquidity. It's not being upgraded, with all due respect, Sherbel, to being an emerging market status, an emerging market S&P. These are results. These are eventually things that will happen if you have the right infrastructure.
Okay, so what do you think needs to happen? Give me your top one or two priorities.
See, the issue, we talk about regulations, and we talk always about regulations. I don't think we have a lack of regulations here. We have a lot of regulations. There's books of regulations. There's regulations that are actually over-regulated in some cases. The problem is execution, implementing these. When is the last time you heard about any kind of punitive action against an investor that manipulated the market? Ask any stakeholder in the market, he will tell you about many cases that are very clear manipulation of the market. When did we hear about an investigation? When did we hear about a kind of a result of an investigation? How can you create the trust relationship that is required for new companies to come or for new investors to come if you are not doing any action or implementing these regulations? We don't need more regulation. Please implement the existing regulation before bringing new regulations.
Yes.
I would like to add what Fadi has said, with one difference. Regulation is I think is a follow-on to ecosystem. Unless we have graduated to a certain level of ecosystem, we cannot have regulations. Because regulations come from experience. And in my opinion, what Neeraj said, I would like to say that ecosystem in this part of the world has grown much faster than many parts of the world. I'll give you an example, and I'm talking in context of innovation. When it comes to innovation, we all think of Silicon Valley, back offices in India subcontinent. But look at the ease of operation of setting up businesses. UAE is far ahead. I can count tens or rather hundreds of companies coming out of India, setting up offices in UAE to support their businesses in India for ultimate client in US. That is innovation. Innovation is just not doing a technology. Innovation is doing something better. And UAE has done it. Since we are talking in context of Sharjah, I will give example of environmental businesses. An environment industry, Sharjah has done exceptionally well. It is known as the leader in the industry. I am very well aware of it, and I don't want to propagate certain things from this forum, which Sharjah government, along with His Excellency Marwan, is doing on environment, which is not just lead in the region, lead in the world. So from that perspective, 3 points which I want to say. We should see where we were as UAE and where we have reached. I think we have done a tremendous growth, but having said that, it doesn't mean that we should sit on our laurels. We should move fast, we should move better. I think we should focus more on developing the ecosystem and the experiences which the stakeholder has, rather than just focusing that, we have to put some kind of a regulatory framework without understanding the requirement of it. Look at healthcare cities, education setup, knowledge village in Dubai, healthcare here, environment here. So this region, this GCC or UAE in this, and Sharjah, they have grown a lot, okay? But yes, we would need a lot in terms of liquidity, I totally agree, because if I go by a survey which was done along with Beehive and Thomson Reuters, the biggest blocking or biggest hamper to innovation, and especially in SME, is capital. And capital will not come unless business sees exits or liquidity. So I think that is where region, GCC, UAE, Sharjah has to find ways to provide liquidity to the stakeholders so they continue to do something, invest, and bring more innovative things.
Yeah.
If I can just add a comment from our side, I mean, as SMP, we've been in the region for quite some time now, and I've been in the region for more than 30 years. If you look at the region, you look at UAE, you look at Saudi, there's 3 main topics that keeps coming up on capital markets. And these 3 issues are, 1 is the region is not liquid enough. 2, corporate governance is lacking, so there should be a lot of work on corporate governance done. And 3 is, there's a lot of companies that have a good valuation, that are profitable, that could add value from a government perspective, so government assets companies and SMEs. These are the 2 sectors from a company perspective that are not IPOing, which grows the IPO, which grows the equity market or the equity capital markets. And there are several reasons for that. A small to medium enterprise, an SME company, will not come to the market of a blue chip index because it has a different requirements. It needs different regulations, it needs different listing processes, which is not, I mean, Saudi has just launched a parallel market, which is Numu, right? Which is very encouraging for the region, and we believe each capital market within that region should be able to follow that. That's 1. 2, liquidity will improve if 2 things. 1 is obviously related to corporate governance, and 2, it is related with a strong regulatory and legislative authority that will enforce, as Fadi mentioned, all these protection laws to the investors and give the listee company a proper equity valuation. And I think we are all working towards that, again, as we engage with different stakeholders within the market. So governments, CM capital market authorities, and other companies, we still feel from an S&P perspective, they tell us, okay, what could we do to make things better? I think, these 3 things that I mentioned, do make sense. I mean, if I have to go just a step back, and I don't want to take long, but in 2010, we launched, and probably most of the people in this room do not know that, we launched a MENA Environmental, Social, and Corporate Governance Index, which looks at 100 companies that are listed within the region, where we include them into our index based on their ESG profile. The average rating for a company was around 35 over 100, which is basically a fail, right? But as we moved along, some of the companies started contacting us and telling us what could we do to improve our scorecard or our rating. I think the average score now is around 50, which is still low, but it has improved from 7 years ago. But on the other side, people are not interested to invest in it because from an ESG perspective, from a corporate governance perspective, it's still not forced to look at corporate governance from that perspective.
I mean, how important do you think it is to have a successful public market versus the, I mean, you can have a, does an SME stroke innovation type economy, does it require a well-operated, transparent, liquid public market to provide you with an exit, or do you think you still live with a kind of suboptimal public market and still have a thriving small business economy?
That's a very good question. I mean, I would say the answer is you do require a public market which is efficient. I think the challenges that you see and hear about should not be a reason not to create that market. I think the focus should be to identify the reasons for those challenges and fix them. You know, I've been in Sharjah for 35 years, and I work for a group which is 40 years old here, and we're across many industrial sectors. And our engagement with the government, whether at a federal level or a Sharjah level, we have seen an openness and receptivity to adopt change. Openness and receptivity to adopt something new, which has not happened. You know, 10 years ago, we created a public company where at that time the 51% test was UAE nationals. We went to the regulator and said we would like the 50% test to be GCC. And yes, I mean, the regulators were receptive to the idea of doing something new. So I think this country, when you look at the rest of the world, look at what's happening in America today, look at what's happening in Europe today, look at the mess they've created for themselves. You know, you compare it to this region has a historic opportunity with a younger generation which is seeking to bring change, which is seeking to create jobs, and that can only come from creating, marrying the businesses which needs capital and creating that economic activity on the capital markets, which is then available for sharing for everybody. So I'm a strong believer in that. I think, yes, there are some challenges the region is going through, but the region is also very flexible to adopt it. You know, I mean, I'll give you a small example. One of the businesses that we look at is tech investing. You know, we've been looking and investing in some major tech companies. I'm amazed continuously by the quality of dialogue we have with family offices in the region. You know, I mean, the dialogue with the people, the knowledge they have is unparalleled compared to what you would see in Silicon Valley. And I think you experienced the same, Pankaj, over that. And so I would say the gap between the region and the rest of the world in terms of knowledge is narrowing. There has been a major change in the stock markets. The capital markets still need some further improvement, but the focus should be on further reform to get more and more businesses onto the stock market.
Yeah, Pankaj, we've just got a couple more minutes, so yeah.
Okay. So, and this is because as Gulf Islamic Investment, we are in the business of making businesses. One thing which we realized, and we have practically got hampered in last 3 years, that whenever we want to initiate a business or incorporate a business, one of the biggest problem we have in this region is that we can't have multi-share class. And trust me, for this simple reason, we have to incorporate businesses in offshore. Because as a promoter and to give investors a preference shares, I don't have the flexibility to own common shares at my end and give a priority to investor. And then we end up either going to Jersey or BVI or Cayman. So there are few things which I think, and I will use this forum to request the authorities, they look at it, and this would give advantage to the region that people will stop going to offshore, stay here, keep the IPs here. Why I can't hold IP? Because again, that I don't have a multi-share class structure. So I think these kind of things, I'm 100% sure that authorities are looking at it, but if they can expedite, because as we say, time is money, but speed is profit. If we want to capture on it, we should seize the opportunity.
That's a good point. And I think, I mean, I do think, coming back to your point, Charbel, about the overall, let's say, the standards of disclosure and governance, although they are historically low, you've seen a trend in the positive direction. I mean, we do a project for the Qatar Exchange where we rank all listed companies according to a set benchmark of international best practice. And we've also seen a significant improvement, but as you say, the average grade is still a fail grade. And I think, without being too harsh, it's probably now is a good time for companies to, and the authorities to address it. And I think you mentioned that Saudi has probably done the most work in that regard. Look, if Saudi Arabia can do it, we can do it. That's got to be an obvious point. I don't know if there's any questions from the floor. Okay, Sadiq, I think we've got time just for one question or maybe two, but yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Actually, I'm from the IFC, and I would like just to make a comment about some of the comments made by the speakers. Number one, access to capital or funding. In the IFC, we have literally hundreds of entities and institutions who are willing to fund, but they are willing to fund commercially viable businesses, not any business. They are here definitely looking for business opportunities. Number two, on corporate governance, situation and the landscape is changing. We at the IFC have actually set up a corporate governance institute, Hawkama, and it's there, and it's a non-profit organization to help corporates, FIs, as well as family offices to adopt, global standards. And the third point made by Mr. Gupta, as far as structures, again, in the IFC, we do have all those structures, be it a family office, be it a trust structure, be it a SPC, SPVs. You no longer need to go to BVIs and, the jerseys of this world. We do have all those structures, and the terms and the requirements are much more favorable. And
Thank
it is in your
Thank you, Sadiq. Yeah, I think that was more of a comment than a question, but you're right. DIFC is...
One comment from my side, just to complement what the gentleman just said. Our corporate governance index is done in conjunction with Hawkama. We worked with Hawkama to get the underlying data together. We got the project funded by IFC back in 2009, 2011.
Oh, that's an interesting point. I think on that note, we're going to have to round up. So it's just a final thank you very much to the panel for your great insights, and sorry we didn't have more time to explore some of those themes. And thank you to the audience once again for your kind attention.